In the last E30 episode, we spent some time learning about the car, specifically everything under the hood. And while we were in there, we found some issues and made some upgrades. Air filter, vacuum leaks, spark plugs, valve cover gasket, and cap and rotor to name a few. Honestly, the car is better than ever. But so far, we've only touched the engine, and there's a ton more to this car. So this week, we're setting our sights somewhere else. Last episode, we spent a lot of time learning about the engine and everything underneath the hood, so I think we should give the same treatment to everything underneath the car. Should be fun. The engine is only a fraction of what makes a car drivable. Today, I'm learning about everything underneath the car, starting with some of the most important parts: the tires, wheels, and brakes. These wheels by Circuit are wrapped in Odd Von Fleeva tires. They are a UHP summer tire, and honestly, they seem pretty good. The car also has brand new pads and rotors, though they could definitely use an upgrade. Under the car is where it gets a little more interesting. What's immediately apparent is that this car already has some poly bushings. The front lower control arm also looks to be relatively new. I also noticed Bilstein struts and Eibach lowering spring, and only a little bit of rust.
Man, I can hardly believe that.
Huh. Well, it's actually a lot better under there than I thought it would be. I was expecting the car to be almost falling apart. This chassis gets notoriously rusty, so the front being in this condition is rad.
Now we're gonna check out the rear.
Checking underneath a car you purchased is always a very frightening thing. It can be pretty costly depending on what you find. Definitely look under it before you buy the car. I did with this one, but obviously I didn't take ramps there, so this is a much more in-depth look. But definitely stick your head under any car you're entertaining the idea of buying. Tires, brakes, rust, leaks, all those are kind of things you want to look for. Under the rear, here's a better look of those Eibach lowering springs next to this tiny, tiny rear sway bar. This is a really good view of the real condition that this car is in. Really, the only rust back here is on some of the hardware for the diff. I would love to get rid of all of it, so maybe I'll undercoat this car at some point. The car looks to have a 373 rear end, as well as a replacement muffler. I will say the whole exhaust system definitely could use an upgrade. More on that later. But honestly, the car looks great under here. Nothing is collapsed and everything's in good condition, so we should ensure it stays that way. Let's go back in time just a little bit. These cars are known for a couple things. One of which, and the most important for this discussion, is just how well they handle. This chassis was set up way better than almost anything you could buy at the time, and it shows. That's why people still race these cars today, and Spec E30 is a thing. Yesterday we inspected the suspension, found a lot of good things, found a lot of things that we can improve. I vote today we get to work on that and start making some handling improvements on this car. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I think the car is really going to respond well to upgraded suspension components, to be honest. I think of this car as a cornering sleeper at the moment, because it's not super fast in a straight line, but in a corner, it could probably hold its own with my other cars, which is really funny, but that doesn't mean there's not room for improvement. So we're gonna do that today. I wanted to come up with a consistent way we could really check if we're improving the handling of this car with any modifications we make. If I drove to my favorite road every time, I wouldn't be able to adjust that much on the fly. So instead I found a loop about 5 minutes away. It has two 40-mile-an-hour S-curves followed immediately by two 90-degree turns. So it's going to be a great place to check body roll and how the car transfers its weight. And with those 90-degree corners coming up immediately after the 40-mile-an-hour corner, we'll be able to check brake braking performance too. The later we can brake and still make the corner comfortably, the better they are. For the benchmark, the car is honestly super solid. It's got a ridiculous amount of balance and grip. It does, however, also have a ridiculous amount of body roll, which makes sense given how old the car is. But I have absolutely no doubt that with just a little bit of love, this car is going to handle a lot better than it does currently, and probably will be my best handling car. There is, however, one concern with handling upgrades on this chassis. This car has the potential to out-handle its own manufacturing. In other words, this car can corner so hard that it will literally rip its own sway bar and subframe mounts out from itself. It's also known for having a bit of body flex, and that means with a lot of cornering, there's a good chance it's going to cave in the strut towers. None of this, however, is a bad thing necessarily, because after all, they're all things we can overcome. This car has a huge aftermarket scene, and because of that, people have come up with fixes for almost every aspect of this chassis' shortcomings. So whenever we make a handling change to this car, we're gonna make sure to include reinforcements for that part specifically. So let's start with the strut towers. These are strut braces, and they're gonna look really cool. Not only will they look cool though, they're gonna make the car a lot safer to have fun in. With a car this old and a dedicated fan base, there's a good chance that whoever owned this car took it on corners. And that means there's also a chance that these strut towers are already caved in. This bar connects to the top of both of the struts in the front and in the rear. And all it does is provide a little bit of lateral support so that when you're in a corner, the outer strut doesn't get pushed in. A car like the TT comes stock with something like this for that same reason. And before even putting it on, we have some good news. The part fits, and normally that's not something you would celebrate that much, but what that means for us is that these strut towers haven't caved in yet. The part is designed to fit a car without caved-in strut towers, so since it fits perfectly, ours is good to go. In other words, we're going to be able to prevent this from happening to this car for as long as it lives. And as far as the install goes, as you can see, it is incredibly straightforward. Both strut towers have 3 bolts, and if you remove the innermost nuts from those bolts, you can set this piece on top and reinstall them. And if it just so happens to not go that smoothly for you because your chassis is already warped, I've heard you can jack up certain parts of the car depending on how your car is warped, and it'll reduce the pressure enough to give you more working room and get it into place. Thankfully, I didn't have to do that though. With the front fully reinforced and torqued down, I went ahead and moved on to the rear. Inside the trunk, you get access to the top of both of the rear struts. And another cool thing I noticed is these already have a reinforcement bracket in place. Believe it or not, the rear strut towers also like to brake. So with this, it will be doubly reinforced. And it's a very similar process to the front. Remove both of the nuts, slide the bar into place, and then reinstall. With that, the strut reinforcement bars are now in place. At best, we now no longer have to worry about the strut towers caving in, or at least we don't have to worry nearly as much. And at worst, we've made the engine bay look a lot cooler. I can't be the only one who thinks beefy strut bars look really cool. And another bonus is that every time I put something in the trunk, I'll be reminded that this puppy's a race car. Or at least that it's less likely to collapse from old age. Even though this isn't a suspension mod, I still think it would be fun to see if this is going to make a difference when we drive the car. So I figure we go do a test lap and take those corners at about the same speed to see if we notice any difference in how the car feels. And honestly, I was pretty surprised by this, but you can kind of tell. It's kind of hard to put into words how chassis flex feels in a corner unless you've kind of experienced it. It's almost like whenever you turn sharply or go over a bump, it takes a second for that feeling to reverberate to the rest of the car. And with these, that's pretty much gone now. While it doesn't technically handle any better, it definitely feels a lot more solid.
Both of the strut reinforcement bars were in the effort of stiffening this car and protecting it against it literally destroying itself from handling too good. I think there's one other thing we can do along those veins that'll be a great upgrade.
If you've stuck around with this channel for a while, you can probably tell where I'm going with this next upgrade. It's been one of my favorite upgrades we've done on every car we've built for this channel, and I think this car will be no exception. This time around, however, it will be quite a bit more involved, and you'll see why in just a second. You remember what I said about how this car can turn so hard that it rips its own sway bar mounts out? Well, these are upgraded and reinforced versions of those sway bar mounts, and they help to fix that exact issue. And since we're throwing these on, we might as well toss on a better rear sway bar.
It's tiny.
This is an ST rear sway bar kit, and don't worry, we'll do the front sometime too. It's no secret that I absolutely love upgrading rear sway bars. It's the most cost-effective way to make your car feel like it's a completely different vehicle. It's a simple mod that helps turn in, rotation, and almost entirely removes body roll. And as far as rear sway bar kits go, I am thoroughly impressed with this ST one. Not only does it come with its own set of reinforcements for the lower sway bar mounts, but it comes with 3 pages of printed out instructions. Now that's nice. You probably noticed just how much hardware this kit comes with, and that's because it also comes with everything you need to build your own adjustable end links, and that is something you normally have to buy separately, so this is seriously cool.
We got quite a few more parts for this sway bar, and that's because we have to do a little bit more than just take the old one out, replace the bushings, and put the new ones in. We need to reinforce it, for one. That's what that kit from Turner was before, the blue one. But the sway bar itself comes with a lot of hardware. And that's because we need to change a good amount about how this car actually behaves. But to do all of that, we're gonna need to make some modifications to the chassis itself. It'll be worth it, but if you're afraid of drilling, maybe don't watch the next part.
So what even is a sway bar, and where is this car's? Every wheel of your car has its own independent suspension. Each side has its own spring and shock. They are, however, connected by something called a sway bar. It connects both sides of the suspension and makes it so that they work together. This car's sway bar is right here, and it is miniature. The main goal of a sway bar is to reduce your car's body roll, or how it leans in a corner, also known as sway. Sway bars offer a couple other benefits too. They help determine just how quickly the rear of your car rotates relative to the front. So the stiffness of a sway bar correlates directly to the amount of oversteer or understeer your car generally feels like it has. Another general rule of thumb is that the stiffer the sway bar, the less body roll your car's gonna have. And these benefits are only noticeable in a corner. So you can install a sway bar on your car and your ride isn't going to be any worse. Sway bars are generally mounted in 4 places. There are 2 bushing mounts, usually on the middle, that secure it to the car. And on the E30 chassis, they're held in with 1 bolt to the thinnest piece of metal I've ever seen. So it's no wonder that these completely rip out. Each side of the sway bar is also connected to an end link, and all that link does is connect it to that side's suspension. So you can remove these. Another cool thing about sway bars is you can easily install them on most cars just by backing onto ramps. Though in hindsight on this car, jack stands are probably going to be easier. But after I got those 4 bolts removed, I figured I was ready to start sliding the sway bar out. On this car, it sits above the diff, and if you pull it out the driver's side, you can bring it across the diff and around the front of the tire. I tried to leave the end links on for this, but I was running into a little bit of clearance issues, so I decided to try to remove them on the car. These are press fit in, so normally it would be a pain to remove these on the car, if they're new that is. Mine, however, are completely crusty and falling apart, so all I had to do was wiggle it a little bit. And then when it finally came off, I had the clearance needed to remove the bar like I was trying to before. As far as sway bar upgrades go, this upgraded sway bar is not large. It's about 19 millimeters for reference. The stock one, however, is about the size of a pencil. So relatively, this is a much stiffer bar, and it's gonna make the car handle and feel a lot better. We also can't just run a 32 mil bar like on the B5 S4. That would just be way too stiff for this car. This is gonna be perfect. This kit also came with replacement bushings and bushing bracket. We'll take the bushings and use these blue reinforced brackets instead. Best of both worlds. Now let's talk about these end links. These look terrible. Thankfully, however, the kit gives you everything you need to rebuild your own, and since we're building them, they're going to be adjustable. This kit really illustrates just how easy it is to make end links for not just this car, but any car. Most of these parts you can just buy at a hardware store, so it'd be pretty cheap to make your own for any car. All they are is a threaded rod with 2 heim joints and 2 nuts. The heim joints and nuts thread onto either side of the threaded rod, and you can change the length. And according to the instructions, these ones should be set up around 4 inches long. So after I got both sides roughly assembled, I went back under the car and threaded in the new sway bar. And this took absolutely forever. I had to pretty much slide it in backwards and rotate it a lot in order to get it to find its way back into the original place, mostly because it's a lot thicker than the bar that came out. That's where I think jack stands would be a lot easier. So let's talk about these reinforcement brackets from Turner. These are a bolt-in upgrade that reinforces a common place that this car tears. But in this case, bolt-in doesn't necessarily mean we're bolting into OEM holes. We're gonna need to do some drilling, and while it sucks to drill into a car that's this clean, holes for a reinforcement bracket are a lot better than ripping the entire sway bar mount out. So I think it's a worthwhile sacrifice. I put the reinforcement brackets in place with the bushings, and then I marked 4 holes at the top of where each of them sit, 2 holes per side. And this is definitely a case where you should measure twice and drill once. These sit under some of the sound deadening in the trunk, so you'll never see them. But since we exposed metal, you want to hit them with a can of paint. In my case, I just used some primer and a turquoise touch-up pen. And since it's covered by hardware and you'll never see it, totally fine. The main goal is just to make sure there's no rust. But with that, we can thread the rest of the bolts on. The original sway bar bushing mount was a single bolt and a single tab holding it in place. This one has 3 bolts in that same tab. It's also got a piece of metal connecting the two on a perpendicular plane, so it is far, far stiffer than before. Tightening those 2 top bolts, however, is the only part of the job where it would be a lot easier with a second person. Neither of the sides are captive, so you need to hold one side and tighten the other. This is one of the only cases I would suggest you use an adjustable wrench. You can clamp it down just tight enough to hold itself in the air, and then twist it so that it's wedged into the suspension, keeping it in place so you can fully tighten it. We will also need to drill out the hole on the rear trailing arm where the rear end link connects. We're only drilling it out a little bit so the new hardware will fit. Once again, hit it with a little bit of paint so it doesn't rust. And a little bit of overspray on the bottom doesn't matter too much since we're putting reinforcement brackets on top of it. These guys don't necessarily provide vertical support. What they do, however, is act as massive washers. They spread out the pulling force from the bar. And what that does is it's going to dramatically reduce the pressure that this hole is feeling when the sway bar gets pulled on. So it's a lot less likely to pull the bolt through. You also have to assemble the bottom half of this end link below the car, otherwise there's no real way to tighten it. It's a little harder to do under the car, but it's no different. I also mimicked that same pattern where the end link connects to the sway bar. You might also notice something. The sway bar is adjustable, so it has 2 different spots that the end link can bolt into. And as you've probably guessed, adjusting which hole we go into changes how stiff the sway bar is. The closer to the center of the bar, the stiffer because there's less metal to rotate. And my general rule of thumb for any sort of an adjustable sway bar is to always start with the loosest. Remember that both of these settings will be much stiffer than stock. And it's like a 5-minute job to switch how stiff it is, so you might as well start with the loosest and work your way tighter depending on what you want your car to feel like. And after I got both sides torqued down, we were nearly done. This job was nearing its end, and I was getting very excited to test out the new mod. This car was going to feel a lot different. Let's talk about irony. I feel like whenever I'm really excited to do one thing specifically, the universe has a way of making me wait even longer for it. In this case, testing the sway bar. I'll have to fix this tomorrow. Where I live, we have two seasons, winter and construction season, so getting screws and nails in your tire is incredibly common, and it happens way too much. I had absolutely everything I needed to plug it. The plan was to plug it so it would hold air and then take it to a tire shop to get it actually fixed. However, we kinda lucked out. As soon as I removed the screw, I didn't hear anything. Normally the tire starts letting out a ton of air, but it turns out this screw was so short and so small, it was stuck in the tread as opposed to poking through it. It did take a little nick out of the tire, so I filled it up with rubber cement, but it's not leaking air whatsoever, so I'm gonna keep an eye on it. What wonderful news though. That means we get to go test our sway bar, much sooner than I was expecting. Driving the car, I immediately noticed a huge difference. Normally, when you turn side to side like this, your car starts to sway, and that is where the sway bars work their magic. The car felt both planted and neutral. Rather than feeling like the car was rolling towards the outside of a corner when turning, it felt like it was flat, almost wanting to dive into a corner. And since the rear is stiffer relative to the front, it rotates a lot better. The car felt just slightly front heavy before, but now it feels incredibly neutral, with even a slight bias towards the rear stepping out. But it's not like it's really going to with how little power this car has. The car felt a lot more controllable through this route. It was able to transfer its weight between consecutive corners a lot faster than it did before. Specifically noticeable in those S corners followed immediately by the 90. It just felt ready to rotate, which is perfect. Plus, all of the parts look so much better underneath the car, since the old sway bar and specifically the old end links were some of the rusty parts that were down there. I've been intentionally driving this car a ton since I installed the bar, and it is honestly one of the most go-kart-like cars I've ever been in, especially now with the amount of rotation in the rear. And in combination with those strut bars, the whole thing feels just so much more solid. In other words, I would say that all the modifications we made today were a complete success, meaning we are one step closer to where I want this car to be. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. I have a ton planned for this channel in the future, and I hope you're as excited as I am. I have some pretty fun plans for this car, but I'm always open to suggestions, so if there's anything you want to see on this build specifically, or any of my other builds, let me know. Either way, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you again, have a wonderful day.